In 1877, the nation was in the fourth year of a depression that had seen the economy shrink by a third. When pay cuts by 4 of the nation's largest railroads went into effect that July, workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia walked off their jobs at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, vowing to shut down the rail yards until their wages were restored. When local police failed to get the trains running, President Hayes sent federal troops to protect the railroad and end the insurrection. But it didn't end. The walkout spread nationwide. Striking workers brought the city of Chicago to a standstill.
We're striking not for a few cents, but for principles. And the spirit of liberty, equality, and fraternity so actuates us that we will stay on strike till the last one of our brothers on the other roads receive their rightful pay.
The Great Railroad Strike lasted 2 weeks. When it was over, 100 people had died. Millions of dollars in property had been destroyed. And the nation had been put on notice that something was terribly wrong. It was the first national strike in U.S. history, and the first time that the federal government had sent troops to end an internal labor dispute. In the following decades, the nation would be struck by wave after wave of industrial conflicts. Americans watched with alarm as businesses shut down, bombs exploded, and troops fired on citizens. To many, it seemed like the nation was moving towards another civil war. Industrialization was transforming the nation, creating a small Anglo-American business elite with unprecedented wealth and power, a thriving middle class, and an even more rapidly expanding class of industrial wage earners, more and more of whom were newcomers to U.S. shores. Although the standard of living for U.S. industrial workers was better than that of European workers, the gap between rich and poor was growing wider and wider. Before the Civil War, the United States had been a nation of farmers.
As of 1875, most people are working in very small workplaces. Most Americans would be working on farms. Even in large cities, which had emerged by this time, most people would be working in small workshops.
By 1900, 2/3 of all workers labored for wages. People who used to work for themselves were now being treated like cheap, interchangeable parts in the nation's vast industrial machine.
I regard my work people just as I regard my machinery. When my machines get old and useless, I reject them and get new. And these people are part of the machinery.
This replacement by machinery of the work that people do began in the late 19th century. It took over many, many industrial jobs, and we no longer have those jobs. And as people were laid off, they couldn't see why this machinery, this introduction of machinery, had to change their lives.
Although wages held steady with prices, most working-class families couldn't survive on the income of a single wage earner. To make ends meet, women and children joined the industrial workforce in huge numbers. Many women worked as factory operatives, especially in the garment and textile industries. They labored under terrible conditions, putting in long hours for a fraction of the wages men received. As an experienced female tailor explained,
I have worked from dawn to sunset, not stopping to get one mouthful of food for 25 cents.
Employers insisted that women themselves drove down wages by flooding the market with their labor. In the late 19th century, 1 out of every 5 children under the age of 16 worked.
Many children were forced to work because of the economy. Their families would have suffered even greater poverty if they did not go ahead and work.
Children would go into mines and into factories at a very young age. It was not unusual to see 10-year-olds in factories and in mines. This was a life where children grew up with very little education and very little time to play and really even be children.
The United States industrial economy paid scant attention to worker health or safety.
Machines were open, pulley belts, wheels, rapidly spinning machinery of all kinds. It wasn't unusual for women to have their hair caught in pulley belts and literally be scalped. Men often had their hands disfigured. In places like Pittsburgh, you could almost tell a man's job by his disfigurement.
In the railroad industry alone, more than 200,000 workers were killed in accidents between 1890 and 1917, more than in any United States foreign war except World War II. In anthracite coal mines, where over 90% of workers were immigrants, 3 miners died every 2 days. Roofs collapsed on workers, toxic gases choked them, or raging fires trapped them underneath the earth.
And if you lost a finger or a hand in an industrial accident and couldn't work any longer, then that wasn't thought to be the responsibility of anyone but yourself. So you couldn't get workingmen's compensation. There wouldn't be anyone to take care of you other than your family. And if a father died in an industrial accident, in a mine explosion, let's say, then the woman and the children would be left to their own devices.
There was one man, his shirt or something or other got caught in that belt, and that belt rode him up to the top of the mill and busted his brains out. He just hit the ceiling of the mill. It killed him.
There were no child labor laws. There was no occupational safety and health laws. There was very little protection for workers, young, middle-aged, or old, in terms of protecting them from what employers wanted to do, which was to maximize their profit.
As late as 1913, 25,000 workers were killed on the job, and 750,000 were seriously injured. So how did businessmen justify these conditions? Success, they said, came to those who earned it. In the U.S., land of opportunity, anyone could rise from rags to riches. All it took was hard work, determination, and a little good fortune, or luck and pluck, as author Horatio Alger said.
Very few people rose. If they rose, it was a small rise. But this leap from utter poverty to being the president of a corporation is pure myth. When you look at who became presidents of large-scale corporations, with very few exceptions, these are people who started wealthy in life.
Darwin had argued that under certain circumstances, but only under certain circumstances, only the fittest animals survived. That argument became applied to American business, in which businessmen argued, and conservative Americans argued, that the reason that some businesses grew larger is because they were the fittest. Not because they had special advantages, not because government may have favored them, not because some of them may have achieved their success through corruption and other means, but because they were the best.
This also meant that the poor deserved to be poor. Assisting such weaklings was useless, some businessmen argued, because nothing could change their natural inferiority. But others disagreed. To Andrew Carnegie, who donated $350 million to charity, the rich had a moral duty to help the poor. Carnegie called this philosophy the gospel of wealth.
The man of wealth becomes the mere trustee and agent for his poorer brethren, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer, doing for them better than they would or could do for themselves. Andrew Carnegie.
American workers and farmers came up with their own vision of the nation, quite different from that of the wealthy industrialists. In the decades following the Civil War, business and labor would fight a brutal battle for the very soul of the United States.
the reasons why they would go out on strike had to do with the fact that they were working, but they weren't making enough money to pay for the things they needed in order to live. They couldn't pay their rent sometimes. They couldn't pay for enough food to eat. They couldn't pay for clothing for their families. And so eventually they would get to the point where they would decide to unite with each other and demand from whoever their boss was for the boss to give them more money.